I'm Rebecca Lowe from the IBA, and joining me in Yangon, Myanmar is Toily Kurbanov, the Country Director for the UNDP. Mr. Kurbanov, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Now, first, I'd just like to ask you about the reform efforts in general here. Some people say that they're purely cosmetic, that it's just the army taken off their army uniforms and put on civilian suits. What are your thoughts on that?
Reforms are about the difference that they make in people's lives. The origins of the reforms, or the main driving forces for the reforms, may be disputed still. Obviously, there was more than one driving factor that had led to the reform process. But when you walk around the streets of Yangon, when you visit rural places in heartland Myanmar, or in some of the remote areas along the ethnic border, ethnic areas of Myanmar, then you certainly see a lot of difference that suggests that reforms were much more than about the cosmetic change. You see people are now much more open to engage the foreigners. Even more important, they're much more open to engage their own government, where they used to avoid any government presence or any government interaction. They're having a dialogue, they're interacting. Sometimes they're challenging the government. Sometimes they're having a genuine dialogue about the future priorities. So I'd say that the reforms in Myanmar are real. They've made a lot of difference over the last few years.
And you mentioned there are different factors behind the reform. What would you say was the motivation or the different factors involved behind the motivating factors behind reform?
Well, there's a lot that is you could find in the literature, obviously, and asking people about. I think it's best to ask Myanmar people around what their own assessment is of the driving forces of the reform. In my own view, and of course you're talking to an outsider here, one of the most important reasons why the government had started the reform process was the growing realization among the elite, and not just among the rest of the population, that Myanmar is significantly lagging behind the rest of the region. And Myanmar being such a distinguished culture with long traditions, with a sense of nationalistic pride, and with memories going back to mid-20th century when Burma then and Rangoon were like a major beacon in this part of the world. They kept reminding them that we can do much better than what we're doing now.
How big a role did sanctions play, do you think, in pressuring Burma to open up?
Well, you're talking to the wrong person, Rebecca. I'm not an expert on sanctions. From our experience, though, we have never seen sanctions leading to any change in any part of the world. There could be possible exceptions. But the changes that really matter in any country are the changes that have to do with homegrown dynamics, with homegrown concerns, sort of the indigenous changes that are informed by the culture, by the society, by the different realignment within the elite groups. And therefore, it would be a huge leap of faith to believe that any external pressure would have made a lot of difference in this country, although there are different theories to that extent.
Do you feel that the reform efforts have still got the same momentum behind them as they did at the beginning? So we have seen a new spate of arrests, imprisonment of journalists and activists and farmers and ethnic minority groups in the last few months. I mean, is that problematic?
These are facts that are source of significant concern for the larger part of the Myanmar society, and of course for the external actors as well, including for the United Nations. That said, we believe that there is certain reform dynamics that is reinforcing itself. We believe that the major achievement, perhaps, of the reform process over the last few years is that there are many more change agents in the society right now who are spearheading the reform process and who will probably not let it go back, not let it reverse. So that is a reason for significant hope and optimism. That doesn't belittle the existing problems and the issues. But we believe that the reforms have achieved a lot of progress. Of course, there is a lot more to do in this country.
How significant was the release of the political prisoners last year? And we saw another 3,000 prisoners released this year, although I think the number of political prisoners was quite small. Is that a significant move?
I think it's a very symbolic move. I think it was meant to be a gesture of goodwill. And I think it was also meant to open more doors for dialogue between the ruling forces and different other actors who are not in the ruling establishment. So that's definitely a positive factor and positive development.
There's been a lot of talk about reforming the constitution. A lot of people are pushing for that, and they say that that is at the heart of the reform process because it gives the military a lot of power, it prevents Aung San Suu Kyi from running for president. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the constitutional review is a matter that belongs strictly to the sovereign domain. We believe that's the matter best resolved between the domestic actors themselves, and we would refrain from any comments about the constitutional review process.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the human rights concerns.
Sure.
I mean, we obviously had serious conflict in the ethnic areas for decades. A series of peace agreements, or at least ceasefire agreements, have been signed in most of these areas. But the Kachin Independence Army is still yet to sign. Is this a problem, and is this being addressed?
Yes and yes. It is a problem, and it is being addressed. The government and the ethnic forces have had a round of reasonably successful consultations over the last 2 years. I think they moved to a large number of ceasefire agreements that are in place. And as they've been negotiating the future identity of Myanmar as a nation state and of the Myanmar people, I think they sorted out one level of issues, and then they need to address the remaining issues. The essence of the process is about defining the future identity of the Myanmar as a culture, as a country, as a nation.
And do you believe the future of Myanmar is as a federal state, or is that something, again, for the Myanmar to work out on its own?
Well, we hope that Myanmar will be an inclusive state, and that Myanmar will have an inclusive identity that will reflect the true diversity of this country. Different ethnic groups, different religions, men and women, children and older people.
What about this very thorny, sensitive issue of peace and justice? This comes up a lot, especially in international dialogue, and there are people, certainly in the international community, who are calling for accountability, for a UN Commission of Inquiry, potentially, if the evidence is there, for a referral to the International Criminal Court. There are others inside the country who seem to be pushing more for reconciliation. Where do you stand on that?
We have full respect in the collective wisdom and judgment of all the main actors in the national reform process, including the peace process. It's up to them to decide what are the major mechanisms of the process they need to have in place in order for all these thorny issues to be removed, and then agree on the future Myanmar that will be inclusive and reflect the diversity of this country.
Are you supportive of what the country decides in that respect?
We will be supportive of a national consensus on this issue, yes.
Right, okay. And regarding the Rohingya issue, this is a very sensitive issue, and it's a political issue, but also a cultural and a social issue as well. What moves are being made to address that at the UN?
Well, Rebecca, as you would know, Rakhine State has been in the situation of protracted emergency over the last more than 2 years now. And our main concern in the international community, including the UN agencies, as well as the non-governmental organizations, was to make sure that those people who suffered as a result of the conflict, who had their livelihoods lost, their shelter is gone, who ended up being displaced, and there's more than 100,000 of them, that they have access to life-saving services. So that was and remains the main focus of the United Nations in the Rakhine State. It's not an easy area of work. Not only sensitive, but also there are significant concerns about people's access not only to the livelihoods and homes, but also the health services, to the educational services. I mean, there are kids, thousands of them, who didn't go to school for 2 years, and that's a horrible fact. And these kids, I mean, thousands of them, will have this as part of their identity, this experience, for the rest of their lives. We hope they will go back to school very soon. Then, in addition to the humanitarian concerns that are our main focus, we also realize that there has to be a space for development solutions in Rakhine State. Rakhine is considered to be one of the poorest places, in one of the poorest countries in Southeast Asia. There is significant parts of the population, more than 50% in certain localities, that are living below even the nationally defined poverty line, that don't get sufficient intake of calories, basically. And therefore, we believe, in addition to the humanitarian concerns, there has to be a significant development effort in that part of the Myanmar. We've been working with the government, with the international community in trying to create space for development solutions. That said, Rakhine is essentially a political problem, and therefore there is only a political solution to a political problem. We do hope, though, that both humanitarian solutions and development solutions will help national actors to create space for themselves and to come up with a political, long-lasting solution for the Rakhine state.
It is currently the UN which is overseeing a lot of these camps, these displacement camps. Will you be handing over to the government authorities at some point? Will they take ownership of this issue?
We hope they will take ownership. We have colleagues in the humanitarian system, humanitarian part rather of the United Nations system, who are in daily dialogue with the government about the long-term future of those camps and of the people, the prospects of them having back their livelihoods. But in the meantime, also, there is a dialogue with the government about ensuring that these people staying in the camps have access to health services and to the educational services.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts about the government proposals regarding the citizenship law? Some people say that this is going to alienate the communities further. Do you think the government's moving in the right or the wrong direction?
I think government is operating in a limited political space, and they're trying their best to come up with what they see are best possible solutions. Perhaps the solutions that they're offering now are not perfect solutions, and quite likely they're deeply flawed solutions. But the government is trying. So we will look forward to the outcome of their efforts, and we hope that the outcome will confirm the government's intention to return back the lives of these people to normalcy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the former UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in Myanmar said that the abuses committed against the Rohingya may amount to crimes against humanity. Is that something that's being looked into?
He presented those views to the General Assembly. As we know, the current Special Rapporteur has also presented the report to the General Assembly that has reference to not only positive developments in the Rakhine State, but also significant remaining concerns about people's access to their basic human rights. We're looking forward to the outcome of negotiations over the resolution on human rights at the General Assembly.
And you spoke there about the problems affecting the internally displaced people and the refugees, but there are serious problems with unemployment among general youth in Myanmar across the country. Is enough being done to address that specific problem?
Enough being done by the international community or by the government?
Yeah, by the UNDP and also by the governments of Myanmar as well.
Look, Rebecca, we think that in terms of development efforts in general, it is the government's primary responsibility to drive the development process in this country. Of course, this government has an enormous legacy that they're trying to deal with. We do not expect them to deal with all issues at the same time. They seem to be genuinely focused on improving the livelihoods of the population. Government has reduction of rural poverty as one of their major policy concerns. Government also has access to jobs and development of the capacity of the youth as one of their major concerns. Some of it is strong rhetoric. Some of it is rhetoric that is translating into action. And some of it is action that is also done jointly with international partners, including UNDP. We, for example, have been a strong partner of Myanmar people over the last 20 years in helping to establish access to microfinance services in this country. A lot of thousands of young people, including young girls, have benefited from access to microfinance. And based on the studies and evaluations available to us, many of them have graduated from dire poverty. They haven't made it to the middle class. That's the big issue in Myanmar, that even if you deal with dire poverty, the society will be on a reversible path on change and reform once there is a solid middle class, to speak of. So there is a glass half full and glass half empty perspective. There's something that's been done, but much more could be done and should be done to see that Myanmar does reach a status of development where even if not everybody is well off, but at least the majority of the population will be standing on their own and can qualify to a middle class status.
And a lot more people have mobile phones now than they used to have, which is a good sign that things are moving in the right direction.
Yeah, mobile phones are now almost like public goods. Everybody has them.
Aung San Suu Kyi made a speech recently to the ILO when she said about unemployment levels in the country that it's not about joblessness, it's about hopelessness, which is quite a nice, pithy saying. And it's what her point was, is that people are feeling disaffected, they lack confidence, they're not invested in society. Is it going to take time before that culture changes?
It will take a lot of time. Well, they've been on the reform track for the last 3 years. And if we remember recent history, the Chinese reforms have started, of course, every country has their own unique circumstances, but it's useful sometimes to try to draw broad parallels. Chinese reforms have started at the end of 1978. So the Chinese reform calendar was still in the year 1981. So you could imagine the distance that the country has traveled, however far it seems to be, appears to us right now, is just the beginning of a long journey.
Some say the relationship with China is slightly complicated, though, in that they've done great things for the country and that they've invested in the country, and the Myanmar people very much need China as a neighbour who will invest, will push the reforms forward. But equally, there's a sense that perhaps they haven't been always the most responsible of foreign investors as they would have liked, and we've seen issues with land grabs, for example. Is this a problem, and is something being done to address that?
We don't comment on the relationships between the member states of the United Nations. That said, we do believe that both countries stand a lot to benefit from further developing and deepening their cooperation.
And regarding land grabs more generally, I mean, this is not just an issue regarding China or any particular country. It's to do with private companies. It's also to do with the military in the past. Is this still going on?
It's still going on. A lot of it is being reported in the press, and much more probably is not reported in the press. What is of concern to us that land grabbing is not an abstract issue. There's a very clear human face. The people who are losing out in this contest for land are not the ones who were well off before. They're the ones who've been poor already. So as a result of these developments, there's many, many more people who are pushed beyond the poverty line. And to add more to that, Rebecca, most of the people who are losing out in Myanmar as a result of the land grabbing are female-led households. As Myanmar is developing rapidly economically, and as it's going down the path of urbanization, there's significant outmigration of male, especially working-age male, from rural side to the cities and from the cities abroad. So those who are staying back are mostly female-led households. And they're on the front lines of losing out in the land grabbing. So it's a significant concern, it's a significant human rights concern. It doesn't bode well for the future of this country.
A couple of other issues that also perhaps don't bode so well. Forced labour is one, child soldiers is another. I know there has been a drive to reform both of these issues. Is enough being done there?
As always, there could be much more that could be done. But the commitment is there by all the parties, and we're seeing some genuine effort invested in overcoming these issues.
And another issue is drugs, which I know is something that UNDP is very much involved in. And there was a recent report by the Kachin Women's Association Thailand that claims that the army has actively promoted drugs production in ethnic areas, specifically for them, the Kachin state, and they're trying to destroy ethnic communities. Could you talk a little bit about that, your experience of that, your knowledge of that, and what's being done to try and address it?
Well, actually, UNDP is not heavily involved in the drug trafficking and countering agenda. We have a United Nations agency has a significant expertise, UNODC. They recognize that that's a complex issue. It has so many protagonists. It's not that easy to put the blame only on one side. I think it's a complex issue, and it's also a deeply ingrained issue. It will take an effort over a long period of time to make sure that alternative livelihoods are offering much better future to the rural population, to the young people living in remote areas, which are now at the front line suffering from the pervasiveness of the drug issue.
But the UNDP is involved often in HIV-related issues, and this is also, I think they're facing an HIV epidemic, partly as a result of the drugs issue. So is that not something UNDP?
The whole of the UN family is involved in HIV issue. We don't qualify it as epidemic, but it's an important issue to be dealt with, both in remote areas as well as in urban areas, in Yangon and in Mandalay. So you are right, yes.
How important is the rule of law at the bottom of all of these reforms? Do you need that fundamentally to make any progress anywhere else?
Yes, since you're asking development official, not a lawyer, I must tell you that we firmly believe that rule of law is about human dignity, is about people's access to their rights, and therefore it's an indispensable condition for long-term sustainable development in any country, including Myanmar.
And do you feel that those legal reforms are progressing as you would like?
They are progressing. The glass half full perspective about the legal reforms is that there is now a number of emerging actors, protagonists who are advocating for the change in the area of rule of law. Though Aung San Suu Kyi had always played a very prominent role, but there's now also a cadre of officials in the government and the parliamentarians who deeply care about the rule of law issues, and that inspires confidence that even if their measures so far were not complete, that agenda, which is a very complex and broad agenda, will remain on the top of the priorities for both the government and the opposition.
Just a final question about investment in Myanmar. How important is it that the foreign investors think responsibly about their investments and don't rush in? And do you think that they should use their investment potential as leverage to force further human rights and legal and social and political reforms?
Yeah, I think it's not a binary option. Either you're staying outside or you're staying engaged inside. I think there's a lot of possibilities in between the extreme options, and you've, I think, alluding to some of those. The private sector can play an important role in promoting responsible investments. We think that the initial signs have been quite promising. A lot of companies in Myanmar have signed up on responsible investment agenda or corporate responsibility agenda, social responsibility agenda, as we refer to it sometimes. What has to be said also about the investment climate in this country is that over the last few years, the majority of foreign direct investments have been sourced from the countries in East Asia and South Asia. And that is probably likely to remain the trend looking forward as well. So it's important that when we spread the messages about responsible investment, we recognize that those messages need to be spread not only in the Western world or in the Northern Hemisphere, but also to Myanmar's traditional partners in this part of the world.
Mr. Kurbanov, thank you very much for your
Thank
time.
you.